Welcome, everyone. My name is Naomi Hausman. It is my privilege to serve as the Director of Institutional Advancement at Gratz College. Thanks to each of you for joining us for tonight's lecture, Creating 21st Century Readers in Jewish Education, presented by Dr. Ziva Hassenfeld. Before we get started, a few important notes. First, if you have any questions for Dr. Hassenfeld, please share them in the Q&A on your Zoom toolbar. There will be time for Q&A in the last part of our hour together tonight. And as always, we are recording the program and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel where you will find many other of our past lectures and programs. So now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Zev Ellis, the president of Gratz College. Welcome, Zev, the floor is yours.
It is always my dutiful pleasure to follow you, Naomi.
Thank you.
Happy Lag BaOmer to everyone and welcome to the inaugural Elizabeth T. and Abram P. Piwosky Memorial Lecture for Emerging Scholars in Jewish Education. The provenance of this program is rooted in an encounter that took place over 100 years ago. It was actually at a party convened by an outfit called Hatikva Juniors and hosted at Gratz College. There, Abe Piwosky, a Gratz student, met Elizabeth Tubas. The couple married a few years later and started a family that has ever since been anchored in Jewish education and religious life in Philadelphia for many decades. Abram Piwosky was superintendent of the Hebrew Sunday School Society, an institution founded by Rebecca Gratz in 1838. He also led the Adat Jeshurun, the AJ, congregation school for 3 decades from 1921 to 1951. He held officer roles within the United Synagogue, Camp Ramah, Solomon Schechter Day School, and B'nai B'rith. Elizabeth taught kindergarten at that same Hebrew Sunday School Society and founded the Volunteers Program at the Federation of Jewish Agencies, now the Federation of Greater Philadelphia. She also helped lead the Jewish Soldiers Canteen at the Jewish Welfare Board. Through their leadership within the arena of Jewish education, the Piwoskys remained deeply committed to Gratz College. A longtime member and past secretary of the Board of Overseers, Abe received the Alumni Award for devotion to the college and its Alumni Association, 1947, was recognized for outstanding contribution to Jewish life, 1955, and was honored with the Gratz Community Award, 1968. I suspect that, given the times, these were in fact meant to acknowledge both Abe and Elizabeth's outstanding leadership. The Piwosky Memorial Lecture was recently endowed by their daughters, and I'm thrilled to single them out, Nona Levin Abrams and Joan Wall, themselves exemplars of Jewish education and committed leaders of our Philadelphia Jewish community. Their decision to partner with Gratz College to support scholarship in the field of Jewish education carries forward a legacy that is stretched for more than a century. It traces back to a Zionist young people's gathering that blossomed into a multi-generational commitment to advancing and energizing Jewish education in Philadelphia and beyond. Owing to that, this is the inaugural program. I am entirely pleased to introduce Dr. Ziva Hassenfeld to commence this important lecture set. Dr. Hassenfeld is the Jack Joseph and Morton Mendel Assistant Professor in Jewish Education at Brandeis University and Assistant Director of Research for the Mendel Center. In academic terms, Dr. Hassenfeld studies reading comprehension from a sociocultural perspective, focusing on how children develop interpretations of the Hebrew Bible as a case of student reading development. In regular parlance, what Ziva Hassenfeld is one of the leading scholars of Jewish education who is taking the very best of scholarship and research in general education and synergizing it with all forms and all sites of Jewish education. She is a dear friend I've known for some time, creative, deeply committed to the proposition, the value proposition that is offered through Jewish education. Her topic this Lag BaOmer evening is creating 21st century readers in Jewish education, and it is my thrilling pleasure to at least remotely bring Dr. Ziva Hassenfeld to the Jewish community here in Philadelphia and far beyond. Thank you so much for joining us.
I am so thrilled to be with you all tonight on this Lag BaOmer. To the Piwosky family, I am grateful for your investment in Jewish education, to be part of this memorial lecture, and to spend the evening with a group of people who care and are invested in Jewish education. Because without any hyperbole, I believe in my heart and in my scholarship that there is perhaps nothing more important than Jewish education and the people who make it happen. So thank you for being with me tonight. And this evening, I am going to talk and hopefully have a conversation through the Q&A about how students learn to interpret texts and how Jewish educators have an essential role to play in teaching students about textual interpretation. And that in a moment where children and adults are asked to participate in textual interpretation, perhaps more frequently and at a higher pace than ever before. But before we get into, as my friend Zev said, academic parlance, I want to just take you through an imaginary classroom that has no academic, well, perhaps it does, but no obvious academic valence to it. And I'm thinking about gym class. And I'm going to, despite the rain outside, I'm going to imagine this gym class outside. Maybe 2 days ago when it was warmer here in Boston. And I want to put a group of 6-year-old children in a circle and a gym teacher and a pile of balls in the middle of this circle on this beautiful field with 70 degrees weather. And I want you to sort of close your eyes for a second and imagine this scene, which is part and parlance of any elementary school and even preschools. And I want to suggest this, that when you have those children in the circle and you have that gym teacher there, she actually has a choice in that moment, a choice that we often don't think about. She can either tell the group of students the game that they're going to play with that pile of balls, teach them the rules to that game, and then perhaps model how to play that game, be it dodgeball, be it catchball, volleyball, or she can say nothing at all and let the kids decide what they want to do with the pile of balls, at which point either a leader in the class will pick up the balls and teach their classmates the game they want to play, or each child will take their own ball and play whatever they want. And I start with this analogy because, as surprising as it might sound, I actually think that this situation is quite analogous to classrooms where students read texts. Teachers and people outside of school commenting on school often think that a text has a single one right way to read it. But I want to suggest tonight that just like the game with the balls on the field, texts also lend themselves to many different games. Of course, in this case, I'm talking about interpretive games. Interpretive games, each with their own set of rules. That is, anytime we pick up a text, we have a choice what game we want to play. For example, I can pick up this text and say, I'm going to focus on the words on the page. I'm going to look for literary devices. I'm going to look for allusions, and I want to really immerse myself in the words and find my meaning that way. Or I can say, for me, or for this text, or this moment with this text, what's particularly important is who wrote it. Who was that person? What's the historical moment they lived in? And what were their own life experiences and values? And that is going to help me decide what this text means. And finally, or not finally, because it's not exhaustive, but finally in my examples, you can read a text saying, actually, I'm sitting here and I want to monitor my own experience. How is this text making me feel? Where is it getting me emotional? Where is it getting me upset, right? And decide the meaning of the text is going to be primarily based on my own reaction. Each of these are different interpretive games a reader can play with the text. And just like the gym teacher that I opened with, a text teacher actually has two options. First, they can follow an approach that has been called in educational theory cognitive apprenticeship. In this approach, a teacher would make explicit for the students the interpretive game she wants them to play with the text. So this teacher, she would open a page, read a sentence of the text, and then she might say to her students quite deliberately, I wonder what the author was thinking when they wrote that. When she says this, she invites students to become apprentices to her thinking and makes clear that in her classroom, thinking about an author's intention is key to understanding a text. And this is the interpretive game she wants her students to play. On the other hand, a teacher might follow an approach that has been called in educational theory dialogic instruction. And this teacher might deliberately begin her study of a text with her students and say, what do you all think about when you read this text? When she does this, she sends the message to students that it is their interpretive priorities, whatever they may be, that are going to be central to meaning making in her classroom. And in doing this, she is like the gym teacher who puts the pile of balls out on the field, but allows the students to decide what to do with them. Both of these pedagogical approaches have strengths, but they also have limitations. Cognitive apprenticeship makes it explicit to the students in the classroom what interpretive game their teacher wants them to be playing. But on the other hand, it fails to leave room for all of the other valuable interpretive games students might want to play with a text. Dialogic instruction, on the other hand, steps into that problem space and says, you know what? Let's leave the interpretive game to be played up to the students to decide. And this is a very popular movement right now in education. The problem, of course, with dialogic instruction is that the conversation can start to feel like one arbitrary comment after the next in this type of classroom. And have you observed in such a classroom, you begin to wonder, wait, what are they talking about? Is every student simply taking turns doing their own idiosyncratic interpretation? The challenge for teachers who choose dialogic instruction is how do they get from the insights of each individual child back to a classroom community? Now, I've offered two approaches to teaching text so far, and I have to tell you that in much of educational research, there's a tendency to do exactly what I just did, to categorize and sort teachers according to one of these approaches or the other. And this sorting, which is so exemplary and foundational of what we do in qualitative research, has the drawback of making it appear as if this is a binary, as if every teacher falls into one of two categories, that either they're working to induct students into particular ways of reading texts, a particular interpretive game, or they're simply there to support students in pursuing their own interpretive interests. Now, of course, being in a virtual room with so many educators, what I am about to say will hopefully resonate. In the hundreds of hours of teaching I myself have analyzed in my research, it has become clear to me that actually no teacher falls into one of these categories or the other, because classrooms are simply too complicated. All teachers draw on both of these approaches at some time. That is to say, I have observed in teachers' classrooms, in Jewish studies classrooms, in general studies classrooms, where in an interview with the teacher, they tell me just how committed they are to cognitive apprenticeship, that they have a particular method of textual interpretation that they wish to teach their students. And yet when I enter their classroom, eventually, a week or two in, I inevitably see the moment where they make room for a student to bring an alternative interpretive framework. Likewise, I have worked with teachers who tell me in our interviews, no, my mission, my single mission as an educator is to help students articulate their interpretations. I've seen these teachers a week in, 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in. At some point, the conversation goes somewhere they don't want it to go, and they rein it in because it feels simply too far afield. I say this because it's important to acknowledge that we're always doing both. We are always trying to balance, on the one hand, a desire to induct students into particular ways of reading that we feel are valuable, that we know readers before us have used. And at the same time, wanting to make space for the ways of reading that students bring from their home or bring from a different classroom or even a previous classroom in the same subject area. Of course, I'm here tonight because I study a particular context in text education. My love, my first love, is Tanakh. And my research and my own teaching has been in Tanakh classrooms, specifically in Jewish day schools. And the reason why I study Tanakh, besides my own deep, profound love from a researcher perspective, is because I actually believe that it is the Tanakh classroom and the text classroom in Jewish education that is going to help cast the tension, this inevitable tension in teaching between cognitive apprenticeship on the one hand and dialogic instruction on the other hand, in particularly sharp relief. In other words, Jewish education offers an instructive case for all education. This is because when we enter the context of Jewish studies classroom, we often find teachers who feel very strongly that they wish to teach their students how to read the right way. And yet, as we all know, who have stepped in front of a group of Jewish students, we often face a room with extraordinarily different conceptions of sacred text. And the stakes are quite high. That is to say, that while students don't often hold deep conviction around who wrote Harry Potter, they might about who wrote the Bible. When we enter Jewish studies classrooms, the temperature simply gets higher. And I say higher in a productive way, in a good way. The temperature gets to the place where we can see dynamics that are actually simmering everywhere. Because the dynamics of interpretation that one finds in a Tanakh classroom exist in all text classrooms. That is to say, if you enter the AP English Lit classroom and you find the teacher who has decided that she is going to focus solely on the words of Silas Marner, you'll inevitably find the student who insists on considering George Eliot's identity as a woman in Victorian England. This raises the question for the teacher. Is this a moment to practice cognitive apprenticeship and ask students to ignore their background knowledge? Or is it a moment to practice dialogic instruction and allow the conversation to go in a different direction? Now, of course, I not only believe that it's inevitable that teachers need to do both, depending on the moment, but I believe it's a good thing. I believe that actually, when teachers are able to articulate a set of interpretive rules that can guide the classroom discussion, that they provide their students with a clear interpretive game to play. And yet, with a clear interpretive game, teachers also need to make room for students' different interpretive interests and alternative interpretive games. So the question that I want to ask tonight and offer an answer to you all to think about with me is, how exactly do we help teachers develop the self-awareness and skill to know which to do when to say, no, this is the interpretive game we are playing, let me teach you how to play. And when to step back and say, I see that you're bringing a valuable way of reading that is important to you. Help us understand the rules. And what I want to offer as a framework to teachers and all educators for understanding the interpretive dynamics in their classroom is one that might help them know when to stand firm in their rules and when to be more flexible. And this framework distinguishes between two kinds of conversations that students can be having in any educational context. In the first conversation, let's talk about a text classroom. Everyone is playing by the same rules. They're offering and debating interpretations within the framework of a particular interpretive game. Let me give you an example. I have seen and met and admired many Tanakh teachers who treat the text as a repository of moral messages. And for these teachers that I have worked with, the most important question is always, what is the message of the text? What ethical lesson is the text trying to teach us? I have met other teachers and worked with other teachers who I love and admire, and whose goal for their classroom is to analyze the Tanakh as a literary text. For this group of teachers, the most important conversation is always to notice and interpret textual ambiguities and literary devices and decide what they mean. So we enter different Tanakh classrooms and see different interpretive games happening. The best teachers always know what game they want their students to play. But at some point in every classroom, I will not promise you, but I'm pretty confident about this. At some point in every classroom, there will be a student who will say or do something that suggests, hey, I don't want to play that interpretive game. It's awesome that you are able to tell me what you want me to do with the text. That in itself is a tremendous pedagogical achievement. And I can tell you what you want me to do, but I don't want to do it. At these moments, I suggest the classroom ought to shift into what I will call tonight the second conversation. Okay, let me give you an example. Let's learn some Torah. So I was once in a 7th grade class, and the students were discussing the creation story in Genesis 1 in Breshit Aleph. And they came to the poetic line of human's creation in verse 27. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar u'nekeva bara otam. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The students in this class were going back and forth about the meaning of this verse. They debated whether this text had implications for the equality of men and women. Did the fact that the text says God created man and then only later includes female suggest that the text sees men as superior to women? Or did the fact they were created together suggest some sort of equality? And the classroom, the temperature was high. The students were on fire with this question. It felt pressing. At that moment, they thought the way to answer the question was to analyze the text itself. What was the poetry saying? And then a student, Sam, I'll call him, raised his hand and said this. I'm Sam now. I want to address something pretty big. We've all been functioning in this class under the idea, for argument's sake, that the Torah was created by God. But what if we take a different idea that other people have had? That the Torah was created by multiple writers over thousands of years. So I think it could have been written with the intent to have women be inferior to men. Like, that's the point of the story. It's a creation story, but we have to think about who this was written by and the time it was written, says Sam. Wow. This is the paradigmatic moment where the student is saying, guys, time for the second conversation. Because Sam identified the rules that his class had been playing by and playing very nicely by and was deeply engaged in the game. They were reading the text closely as if it was the word of God. And Sam in this moment proposes an alternative interpretive rule. He says, hey guys, let's read the text as if it was written by powerful men a really long time ago. Sam proposes an alternative interpretive game and eloquently moves the class into the second conversation. What do you think, guys? Should we switch the rules? Instead of talking about what the text means, Sam wants to talk about how we decide what the text means. And it is this move from talking about the text to talking about the rules we follow when we interpret a text that constitutes the difference between the first and the second conversation. Now, for my teachers with me tonight, let me say this very clearly. Students who move class discussion, text discussion into the second conversation are not as articulate or sophisticated as Sam. Attempts to start the second conversation are usually much more subtle and sometimes can feel a little bit like someone is making a joke. And for these reasons, students who try to move a class into the second conversation can often get ignored, right? Because we're not looking for it. Teachers aren't prepared to productively engage students who challenge the basic premise of the class. It's hard enough to teach the students the rules of the interpretive game that allow us to have the first conversation. On top of that, now we need to be ready and listening for the second conversation? I think yes. Because when we don't listen for the second conversation, we miss an opportunity to teach students a fundamental truth about the nature of reading. Whenever we read together, whether it be Tanakh, the newspaper, dare I say it, a tweet, we read together and we decide the rules we will follow for making meaning. We do our students such a service when we teach them that there are always rules operating, that we can change those rules if we want to and offer a different interpretive game. And when we do that, we often yield a different, but perhaps no less, or certainly not without any less valuable meaning. When teachers refuse or just simply miss the opportunity to have the second conversation when students ask for it, they send the message that actually there's only one right way to read, the way the teacher reads. Now, of course, at the same time, I'm not saying that dialogic instruction is without problems. Teachers should pick an interpretive game for their classroom. Teachers should have a way of reading that they care about and they want to teach their students and induct them into. Because when teachers simply leave the interpretive rules up to the students, they often either end up imposing rules anyways, but just without the same level of clarity, or create a classroom where anything goes and collective meaning making becomes elusive. So here's what I'm proposing. Let's, as teachers, be able to both teach an interpretive game, but also always be ready and listening for the need to facilitate the second conversation. Because when we do that, we will create classrooms that create stronger, more sophisticated, and ultimately more empowered readers. So you might be wondering, okay, Ziva, great. You gave us a framework. How do you do it? What's the recipe for teachers to navigate the subtle balance that you are talking about between the first conversation and the second conversation? So here's what I'll suggest, research backed, that actually teaching the second conversation is not one size fits all. It can't be scripted and it actually can't be fully prepared in advance. And this is why. Because teaching cannot be teacher-proofed. Individual teachers, students, and contexts are simply too different. But here's what teachers can do. They can begin to listen for when their class needs to be in the first conversation and when they need to be in the second conversation. To start using the second conversation as a teaching tool, I suggest that teachers reflect and become aware of the interpretive game they want to play in their classroom, and to recognize the importance of that game, and yet that it is always only one option of all the possible interpretive games that could be played. Second, I suggest that teachers should explicitly communicate those rules to students so that students know what game they're being asked to play. Go back to the story I started with. Imagine the field with the balls and the gym teacher. It helps if the gym teacher says, we're gonna play dodgeball. Here's how you play. We wanna do the same thing when we're teaching Torah. We're gonna play X, and here's how you play. We're gonna play Mefarshim, and here's how you play. We're gonna play moral messages, and here's how you play. Third, teachers should begin to notice and train themselves in the discipline of noticing when students are pushing back on their interpretive game, when they implicitly or explicitly, which is easier to see, propose a different game. Now, as I said, it won't always be as clear as my eloquent example that I gave earlier in that 7th grade classroom. But if we train ourselves to listen to it, we can hear it. And finally, teachers need to be willing to try different things at different times, sometimes reinforcing and sometimes relaxing the rules. Because it is only by taking the iterative and reflective stance that we can become better and better at balancing the first and the second conversation. In the end, like all things in teaching, it is constant experimentation and iteration that will allow the way to give students room to explore their own ideas while still creating a space in which shared meaning is possible. Now, this has always been true. And Jewish education and Jewish classrooms has always been the opportunity to help students see the dynamics of interpretation that exist everywhere. But I want to take a moment tonight to acknowledge that we live in a world right now where we are socializing through written text in an unprecedented way. We have students and children who predominantly socialize through text message and emails and WhatsApp. We see a generation where they are communicating through print text. This requires skills of interpretation on a level that we have not seen before. We need to help children understand why texts are inherently ambiguous and what rules they're applying when their feelings get hurt and what rules they could apply to give a different reading to a social text. This is a skill that we can develop in the classroom. This is a skill that I believe that Jewish text, more than any other text, given our tradition of exegesis, provide an opportunity to develop. I want to end by sharing one of my favorite portraits of a good, confident reader. Because, and before I do, as I reflect on the deep partisan divisions in our society today, I am always struck by the extent to which people seem to be playing by different interpretive rules. We need to learn when to move into the second conversation, when to help our students move into the second conversation, but also when to help ourselves move into the second conversation in discourse. If we hope to build an inclusive, diverse, and just society, we need to learn when to stand firm in our interpretive rules and when to open ourselves up to alternative ones. This is a skill that extends beyond written text. The first and second conversation is how we can understand the text of our world, first and foremost print text, but also the text of people, social situations, historical events, and current events. And so I'll end tonight by sharing my favorite reader. The portrait can be found in Tanakh itself, of course, in Shemot Perek Bet, Exodus chapter 2. And who is this great reader? No one else but Miriam, Moshe's sister. The book of Shemot begins with Pharaoh making a decree that every Jewish baby boy is to be killed. And Moshe's mother, Yocheved, hides Moshe when he's born for 3 months, at which point the Torah tells us She's no longer able to hide him. At a loss of what to do, Yocheved puts Moshe in a basket and takes the basket down to the Nile. The biblical text tells us that after Yocheved puts Moshe's basket in the Nile and leaves, it is Miriam, his sister, who remains. She stands at a bit of a distance to the De'ah ma ya'aselo, to know what would be done to him. And then, in a miraculous turn of events, Pharaoh's own daughter appears, the most powerful woman in the land. The biblical text tells us that Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the Nile to bathe. And there at the Nile, she sees the basket that baby Moshe is in, and she has it retrieved by her servants. She opens it, she locks eyes with baby Moshe, who is crying, and she takes pity on this abandoned baby. At that exact moment, Miriam, who has been standing there watching, approaches the daughter of Pharaoh, the most powerful woman in the land, and says to her, "Can I call for you a nursing woman from the Hebrews to nurse?" The daughter of Pharaoh agrees, and because of Miriam's intervention, Moshe is saved and the entire course of history is changed. Miriam, a young girl who just watched the traumatic moment of her mother abandoning her brother, offers the daughter of Pharaoh an interpretation of the scene in front of her. Now, this is an incredible intervention because Miriam approaches a princess, the very princess whose father made the decree to kill all the Hebrew boys. On some level, this is crazy, dangerous choice to make. It's brazen, it's baffling. And of course, I'm going to suggest in this conclusion that it's brilliant because Miriam is reading. She's reading the princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, and she sees a way to approach her. She has the ability to read the princess so well, to understand what is happening when she has pity on the baby, and to know exactly what to say to her, what intervention to make. I want to suggest that Miriam's intervention worked because she was able to read the situation carefully. She saw that the daughter of Pharaoh, who was bathing by the Nile and merely intrigued by a box with a baby in it, not outraged, was a reader not interested in a structural critical read, a read that might point to the harm caused by her father's fear-mongering xenophobia and policy of killing babies. Rather, the daughter of Pharaoh, Miriam understands, only wants a read about this particular baby. The daughter of Pharaoh is content with her world. She is looking into the eyes of a particular crying baby, and she needs an interpretation that focuses on the personal. Miriam notices this and steps into the interpretive rules of Bat Paro. She offers an interpretation of the situation that the daughter of Pharaoh found compelling, that this is a little baby who happens to need food. And with that, was stepping into her interpretive rules and offering interpretation by her rules, Miriam saves Moshe's life. Miriam perfected the skill of moving between interpretive rules for reading the world. She saw that the text of a baby in a basket on the Nile was different for Bat Paro than it was for her. And I want to say that any of us who have fantasized about what we would say given the chance to come face to face with an evil politician in the world can appreciate this moment. Because Miriam understands there is a time and a place for her interpretive rules, and she makes a choice. She has a chance to attack, but she does something different. She can see the situation so clearly, and what interpretation of the text of her baby brother is going to move the daughter of Pharaoh. She has the capacity that is to shift her perspective. Might I end by suggesting that perhaps it is this capacity, this moment of reading in a way where she can move from one set of interpretive rules to another, that ultimately earns Miriam the title of Miriam Haniviyah, Miriam the prophetess. With that, I'll end because Miriam is a lofty vision of the possible. If we can train our young students to read like Miriam, If we can refocus our Jewish studies classroom to teaching students both a particular literate practice, but also the capacity to talk about that literary practice through the second conversation, then we together tonight, well, we, not tonight, but together can commit to raising the next generation of prophets. This, I would argue, is the central challenge of our time. Thank you so much for being with me tonight.
Wow. Wow. So many ways to go. I almost want to challenge whether or not children care about J.K. Rowling's authorship, maybe challenge it for Harry Potter. I was stuck on that, and whether or not the movies influenced the books or vice versa. But my question is, I have two questions. One is my own, and then one is from the Q&A chat. And if anybody would like to submit a question, please, I'm monitoring. First is with regard to Tanakh. To my mind, there are different ways of literacy, of engaging texts. And there is a school of thought that will necessarily ensconce biblical Tanakh in rabbinic literature. Whether it's Onkelos and Rashi, or whether it's much more of a scaffolding, to the point where one might be cynical and suggest that, in fact, we are studying medieval rabbinic commentators, not Tanakh. But given the fact that so much of Jewish tradition and Jewish education places Tanakh already in conversation with super texts, with later texts, that is, does that complicate the games and the openness that we might engage with in Tanakh literacy, Tanakh education?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. So I would suggest that actually if we invoke sort of Holtz's orientation and the idea that, right, which is happening everywhere in education, they're starting to say, wait a second, we talk about a discipline, but we don't really know what the center is and we don't agree, right? Which is what Holtz said 20 years ago. But let's talk about the Mefarshim, the orientation. And the thing is that each of these orientations is just talking about what the text is, but it's not actually talking about how we're going to teach the text. In other words, I've seen schools where Rashi is taught as transmission, right? Like just tell me what Rashi said that meant. And I've seen schools where Rashi is taught as a way of reading, right? What are the interpretive rules that Rashi is following, and how are those different than his grandson Rashbam is following? So in that sense, like what the text in the room is a really important question that's going to depend on in some ways denomination, in some ways context, right? Whether Rashi is seen as authoritative, whether certain midrashic glosses are seen as necessarily part of the text, but it still leaves the question of, well, are you the teacher going to define interpretive rules for your students or not?
Yeah. I remember one time hearing, when I was an undergrad, hearing a Rosh Hashiva, I won't say what's institution, quote a scripture, and the source being Menachot Mem Bet Amud Aleph, a Talmudic source. But your point is well taken, is that very often we're talking about Tanakh education. Sometimes we have to be honest about not just how we are studying, but what we are studying. And if it is an exercise in understanding how various rabbinic commentators understand a particular piece, passage, or couple of words in Chumash, in the Pentateuch, then that's what we're studying. That's very different than taking the text as the primary source and that open interpretive stance that you so eloquently described. And that openness to understanding what is their text is fundamental.
Yes, and I would say a prior to, okay, so are your students participating in the interpretive activity, or are they just observers? Right, so the entire talk was premised on the idea that we want classrooms where students get to participate in the activity of interpretation. So the prior is of what text, And then the next sort of higher level question is participate how? Tell them the boundaries, what's allowed and what's not in your particular classroom, because you know they're going to go into a different classroom with a slightly different boundaries.
Right. Well, here's one question that just came up. Is a very good one. Is in your field work, did you see that in terms of educators who are trying to get to that second conversation level? Are there best practices on how to ensure that it doesn't, his term is, again, this is Jonathan Levin, his family was so gracious with this entire program, to go off the rails, but how does one curate the first and second level conversations, I think?
Phenomenal question, phenomenal question. So I think, let me address the first conversation, because one thing that I wonder about is, am I clear about how much work goes into the first conversation? Like, I'm so excited about the second, but actually as teachers on the ground, as educators on the ground, the work of the first conversation is a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous accomplishment, right? So I say that, like, of course, we don't all have this luxury, but on some level, take 3-4 classes, take the most upsetting class discussion, text discussion you had, and do the exercise of asking yourself, what rules were violated, right? Why was because I did this when I went back after my doctoral work, and I said, you know what, I've learned a lot. Now it's time to teach again, because what's the point of just staying in my office? So I went to 7th grade classroom, became the 7th grade teacher for 2 years while I was doing my postdoc. And I was inundated with dialogic instruction, and that was my top priority, to let the students bring their interpretive priorities. And the first text discussion, after we had broken our teeth on biblical Hebrew, they start talking about, well, how could someone live to 120? And I was so frustrated, and I journaled about it. And then I realized I have an interpretive rule that I haven't named for my students, which is that, as important as the question is, I want you to have a discussion based in this text. And that might seem really obvious, but as a teacher in the classroom, I had not yet said that. So that's the first conversation. The first conversation is naming for yourself as an educator, what rules do you implicitly want your students to follow, and say them, literally write them on a wall. The second, and I spent so much time in this question on the first conversation, because you can't get to the second conversation until your classroom is able to have the first. And that's because the second is when you say, when the student says something that really is inflammatory or just like off the wall, and you say, you know, these are our rules. This is our boundaries. I'm wondering, what rules were you following? What textual assumptions did you bring when you said that comment? Because I really want to understand the game you were playing that got you to that comment. So that's my tachlis. If we were going to do a PD, those are the exercises that I asked teachers and educators to try.
And what of text and translation and interpretation openness? Is there for your point of departure is that it's so important that it's the biblical Hebrew is part of that process. What about reading and translation? What about, is that a barrier? Is that an opportunity?
It's certainly not a barrier, and it certainly is an opportunity, but it's also a moment for educators to remember that if we want students to actually get to play any interpretive game at all, to get to have any first conversation, then you have to let them play. And I say that because we'll always have a lot of really good background knowledge. That's what makes us teachers, right? The question is, when do you deploy it? When do you deploy it to help students, and when do you deploy it to stop them from getting to participate? And so I say that because translation becomes one of those moments where teachers cringe. The kids are reading the text they have access to, and they say something based off of a mistranslation of the Hebrew. But I say to teachers who teach in translation, you had a chance to fix that at the level of making the text. But once you give them the text, you got to let them play. You got to let them play an interpretive game. And so there are affordances and limitations to any way we teach, right? You can cover much more text and translation. Some students don't have access if you do it in the original. but it's just a moment to remember that that you have to sort of check yourself if you want your students to play any game at all, to get to interpret.
And Dr. Sandra Lilienthal, who studied and teaches with us at Gratz, she asked that her area of emphasis, different population are adult learners, where they may have similar questions about the dynamics and authorship, and but they may not want to play the same games. Is there a way to adapt some of this? Maybe they ought to play games, adults and children alike.
I am so glad that question was raised. I find adult education is particularly difficult because the locus of authority is thrown off, right? That there is this sort of, right, you get this privilege when you're working with children, like, of course I want you to learn things and to participate. On some level, you do trust me, right? That like hard work can pay off. Whereas in adult education, there is often this sense of like, but I'm here, and so let me play the interpretive game I want to play. And so I think it's a stickier conversation, but probably more important. Because, and here, I don't have research back, this is just my own experience in adult education, both as student and teacher. I think it would help so much if educators in adult education said, so many games we could play. Here's the one we're going to play tonight. And maybe next week we'll play a different one.
Another question just came in, which is, do you think there is anything, is more anthropology perhaps, when Tanakh is taught in religious schools or day schools or Jewish setting, are the dynamics changed than maybe if it were taught as a work of literature in a more secular site?
No, because that's the beauty of first and second conversation. That's the beauty of this as a framework for all of us, right? Because students move between these contexts. And the student who enters the Brandeis Nedges Bible course might have been a day school student, right? And the day school student might have read Robert Alter or Brettler in their free time. And so we like to imagine that because students are in a particular institution, they only know one particular interpretive game, is just not to realize what it is to be a 21st century reader. And so that's why, because our kids move between worlds and move between interpretive games, and because the skill of being able to name interpretive games as a meta skill is so critical at this moment in our world, that's why I say every single classroom, name the interpretive rules. Name the rules that you are playing by and acknowledge that there are other rules.
Fabulous. Fabulous. So I can't thank you enough. Thank goodness this is recorded, so that as I have to review it again. It's incredible, the scaffolding you provided, the takeaways, and just, I'll say is that what you offered us is a language for how to engage this conversation. First, the interpretive form. We're going to walk away with a real toolkit to both be teachers and learners of all of our important texts, not just Tanakh. Dr. Ziva Hassenfeld, I can't thank you enough for joining us at Gratz College. It's been a real delight. What a way to end the Lag BOMA. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure to be with you all, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining, of course, and to the Piwosky family for your generous support. Thank you so much.